She was invisible until she wasn't. Stephenie Adaora had spent 3 years learning how to disappear inside the Kong estate, how to move through its marble corridors like a shadow, how to serve without being seen. Then the night the East Wing went up in flames, she ran straight into him. Kang Min-ho, the man who owned half of Seoul and the fear of the other half. He caught her by the arms in the smoke-dark hallway, looked at her face for the first time, and something behind his eyes went absolutely still. Like a door he thought was sealed forever had just blown open. Welcome to my channel, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. The fire started on a Thursday. That was the detail Stephenie remembered most clearly afterward. Not the heat, not the shouting, not the stampede of polished shoes on marble floors. Thursday. She had been changing the linens in the third-floor guest suite when the alarm screamed and the lights went red, and Mrs. Park, the head housekeeper, materialized in the doorway with her clipboard and her composure both intact and said, "East Wing. Everyone out. Use the service stairs." Stephenie grabbed her cart by instinct and Mrs. Park said, "Leave it," and she did, because Mrs. Park had the voice of a woman who had managed crises in powerful households for 30 years and had never once been wrong about which things to leave behind. She moved fast. She knew these corridors better than she knew her own heartbeat. 3 years of 6-day weeks had drawn a map of this house in her muscle memory. Left at the portrait gallery. Down past the locked study. Through the connecting door to the service wing. The connecting door was stuck. Not jammed. Locked. From the other side. She pushed twice and then she heard it, the particular creak of the east corridor filling with smoke, and she turned back and ran the only direction left, which was deeper into the main wing, toward the grand staircase, which every household rule she had been given told her never to use. She used it. She was halfway down when she collided with him. He was coming up. Why he was coming up into a burning house instead of out of it was something she would not understand until much later. What she understood in the moment was the impact. His hands closing around her arms before she could fall. The smell of his shirt, which was not smoke but something clean and dark and expensive. And then his face. She had seen Kang Min-ho before. Everyone who worked in this house had seen him. He passed through rooms and they rearranged themselves around him. He sat at the head of the dinner table when important men came to discuss important things, and those men who ran banks and governments and shadows of governments, spoke to him carefully the way you spoke near something that could detonate. She had never been close enough to see his eyes. They were very dark. And they were doing something she had not expected. They were looking at her. Not past her. Not through her. Not with the polite non-recognition that powerful men in powerful houses gave to their staff. Her. With a focus so complete and so still that she forgot for a full second that the East Wing was on fire. He said something. She thought it was her name, but that was impossible because he did not know her name. Then Hyun, his head of security, appeared at the base of the stairs and said something rapid in Korean, and the moment broke and Min-ho moved her. One hand still on her arm, guiding her down and out through the main entrance into the cool October air where the rest of the staff stood in the circular drive, watching the East Wing glow orange against the night sky. She stood in the driveway and breathed. Behind her, she heard Min-ho say something to Hyun in a low voice. She did not catch the words. But she felt, with the particular sensitivity of someone who had spent 3 years perfecting invisibility, that whatever he had said was about her. She told herself she was wrong. The following morning arrived with the particular clarity that came after disaster. The East Wing fire had been contained to 2 rooms. The cause was electrical, a fault in the wiring that the building's inspection records, Stephenie would later learn, had flagged twice in the previous 18 months without being addressed. This information traveled through the household staff with the quiet velocity of things that were everyone's business and no one's to say aloud. She was restocking the main floor supply closet when Hyun came to find her. He was a man of precise movements and fewer words than the movements implied, and he looked at her with the expression of someone delivering a message he had been given exactly and intended to deliver exactly. Mr. Kong has asked that you not use the service stairs until the East Wing structural assessment is complete. He asks that you use the main staircase for the duration. Stephenie looked at him. She had been told on her first day not to use the main staircase. I was told not to use the main staircase, she said. You have been told differently now, Hyun said, and left. She stood in the supply closet with a stack of fresh towels and thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about dark eyes going still in a smoke-filled corridor and told herself firmly that this was a safety protocol. Nothing more, and went back to work. By the end of the week she had used the main staircase 7 times, and each time she had done it with the slight self-consciousness of someone wearing something that wasn't theirs yet. She passed him on the 4th time. He was at the base of the stairs on his phone, and he looked up when she appeared on the landing, and he watched her come down with an expression she could not read and did not try to. And when she reached the bottom and stepped past him, she said, "Good morning, Mr. Kong," the way she would say it to any principal of the household, correct and neutral and nothing more. He said, "Good morning, Stephenie." She did not stop walking. She went through to the west wing and found a linen cupboard and stood inside it for 30 seconds doing absolutely nothing. He knew her name. She told herself this was normal. He probably knew all the staff's names. A man who ran what he ran and managed what he managed would know the names of everyone inside his house. It was a security consideration. It was practical. It meant nothing. She believed this for approximately 4 days. The 5th day, she found a coat on her chair in the staff room. Not any coat. A heavy winter coat, dark green, expensive in the way that did not announce itself but was impossible to miss if you had spent any time at all around expensive things. Stephenie had spent 3 years inside this house, and she knew the difference between department store and something that had been chosen carefully by someone who had noticed what she needed. There was no note. She asked Mrs. Park. Mrs. Park looked at the coat with the expression of someone who had also noticed its quality and had decided very firmly not to have an opinion about it. All staff were issued winter outerwear, Mrs. Park said, at the beginning of the cold season. This is standard. It was October 7th. The cold season had begun. She put the coat on. Fit perfectly. She wore it on her walk to the bus stop that evening and told herself that Mrs. Park had simply ordered the correct size and it meant nothing. And she almost believed it, except that her hands kept going to the collar, which was softer than anything she had owned. And she thought about dark eyes watching her come down the stairs and felt something warm and inconvenient move through her chest. She called her cousin Adiz that night from her small rented room 3 stops from the estate. Adiz said, "Immediately, you sound strange." Stephenie said, "I don't sound strange. You sound like a woman who is having feelings she has decided are inconvenient." Stephenie said, "Good night, Adiz," and ended the call, which was also an answer. The next escalation arrived 11 days after the fire, in the form of a man named Park Sung-chul. He was the 2nd son of the Park family, which made him adjacent to power rather than inside it, and he had been coming to the Kong estate for years to meet with Min-ho about business that Stephenie did not know the details of and did not ask. He was handsome in an uncomplicated way, and he knew it, and he used it with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been told it wasn't working. He found Stephenie in the East Corridor on a Tuesday morning while she was overseeing the post-repair cleaning of the 2 damaged rooms. "You're new," he said, which was the opener of a man who had not checked his information. "I've been here 3 years, she said, without stopping what she was doing. He leaned against the wall. "I would have noticed." She handed a checklist to the junior housekeeper beside her and said, "The 2nd bedroom still needs the ceiling reassessed," and kept moving. Park Sung-chul followed. He said 3 more things, each one slightly more direct than the last, and she responded to none of them, which was the correct professional choice and also the one most likely to be interpreted by a man like him as an invitation to persist. She was aware of Min-ho before she saw him. She had developed this awareness over the previous 2 weeks without meaning to. A change in the temperature of a room. A shift in the quality of the silence. He was at the end of the corridor, very still, and he was watching Park Sung-chul follow her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not the controlled professional face. It was not the face he wore for important meetings or difficult calls or the kind of conversation that required every emotion to be placed behind glass. It was something with heat in it. She turned away from it before it could mean anything and said, "Excuse me," to Park Sung-chul with the finality of a door closing, and walked to the service corridor and did not look back. That afternoon, Hyun told her that Park Sung-chul would not be attending future meetings at the estate. She asked why. Hyun said, "Scheduling conflict," with the face of a man who had been told to say exactly that and nothing more. Stephenie looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I see," and went back to her inventory. That evening she sat in the staff room with her tea and thought about a man at the end of a corridor with heat in his eyes and a rival who had developed a sudden scheduling conflict and her own heart doing something thoroughly inconvenient in her chest. She thought about walls and what they were for. She thought about her mother, who had raised her in Enugu on the principle that a woman who understood her own value did not let the understanding be confused by proximity to power. She thought about what her mother would say about a coat that fit perfectly and a staircase she was now allowed to use and a name said in a low voice at the bottom of the stairs. Her mother would say, "Stephenie, do not build a home in a place that has not invited you to stay." She held that thought. She held it the way you held something that was correct but also hurt slightly. She was still holding it when Minho appeared in the doorway of the staff room. This had never happened before. Principals did not come to the staff room. It was the unspoken architecture of a house like this, the invisible line that organized everything, and he was standing on the wrong side of it with his jacket still on and his expression doing the thing where everything was surface and nothing was. He said, "Stephenie." She stood. Not because she had to, because her body made the decision before her mind caught up. He looked at her for a moment, then at the tea in her hands, then back at her face. He said, "Mrs. Park tells me your transport arrangement takes you past the construction works on Mangu Road." She said, "Yes." He said, "That road has been dangerous at night. Hyun will drive you until the construction is finished." She opened her mouth. He said, before she could speak, "This is not a conversation. It is a logistical decision." She closed her mouth. He left. She sat back down and looked at her tea and thought about her mother's advice and also about the specific quality of a man who said this is not a conversation in a voice that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding, and she thought that she was in considerably more trouble than she had bargained for. Hyun drove her for 4 nights. On the 5th night it was not Hyun. It was Minho. She got into the back seat before she looked at the driver, and when she looked she went very still and then she said, "Where is Hyun?" Minho looked at her in the rearview mirror. He had another engagement tonight. She looked at the Seoul night moving past the windows. She said, "You don't drive your own staff home." He said, "I drive where I choose." She said nothing else. The car was warm and the city lights moved across the glass, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and the small warm thing in her chest expanding in a way she could not stop and did not know what to do with. He said, "After several minutes, you've been here 3 years. She said, "Yes." He said, "You've never asked me for anything." She said, "That's not what I'm here for." He looked at her in the mirror again. She looked at her hands. They rode in silence the rest of the way to her stop, and when she got out he said, "Good night, Stephenie," the way he said her name like it was specific only to him, like he had decided it belonged in his mouth and intended to keep it there. She walked to her building and stood inside the entrance for a full minute before she took the stairs. That night she called Adiz again. Adiz said, before Stephenie had finished the first sentence, "How bad is it?" Stephenie said, "I don't know what you mean." Adiz said, "How bad are the feelings you are still insisting are inconvenient?" Stephenie sat on the edge of her bed and said, "Very." She paused. "He drove me home." Adiz made a sound. That sound said everything her words were choosing not to. Stephenie said, "I know." Adiz said, "Stephenie, you are one of the strongest women I know. But you are also one of the most committed to standing just outside of good things because you are afraid they will not hold." Stephenie said nothing. Adiz said, "I am not telling you to do anything foolish. I am telling you to stop deciding in advance how it ends." They said good night. Stephenie lay on her back in her small room with the city sounds outside and thought about a man who drove her home and said her name and had a coat made to fit her and thought about nothing else for a very long time. The following morning she made a decision. She made it the way she made most serious decisions, quietly and completely, without announcing it to anyone. She was going to be professional. She was going to be correct. She was going to stop noticing the way he stood in doorways and said her name and looked at her in rearview mirrors. She was going to do her job with the thoroughness and the invisibility that had served her for 3 years, and she was going to stop building a story inside her chest that no one had written for her. She managed this for approximately 6 days. The disruption arrived in the form of 2 things that happened on the same afternoon, which was the kind of thing that happened when the universe had a sense of narrative economy. The first thing was that she was called to Minho's private study for the first time in 3 years. She had cleaned that room. She had restocked it. She had moved through it the way she moved through all the rooms in this house, with efficiency and invisibility. She had never been summoned to it. She knocked. He said, "Come in." He was at his desk with a folder open, and he looked up when she entered, and she stood near the door with her hands folded, and he said, "I've been informed that your work contract is up for renewal at the end of the month." She said, "Yes." He said, "The renewal terms have been updated. Your responsibilities will remain the same. Your compensation will increase by 40% effective immediately." She looked at him. He looked at the folder. She said, "That's a significant increase." He said, "Your performance merits it." She said, "I have not received a performance review." He said, "I have been paying attention." The room was very quiet. She stood near the door and he sat at his desk and neither of them moved, and the silence between them had the particular weight of something that was not about contracts at all. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Kong." He said, "Min-ho." She blinked. He said, "You've been in this house 3 years. My name is Min-ho." She said, "I'm not sure that's appropriate." He looked up from the folder then, at her face, direct and completely steady. He said, "I've stopped being interested in what's appropriate." She should have said something professional and left. She was aware of this. She was aware of her mother's voice and her own good sense and the invisible line that organized this house and everything that was correct and expected of her. She said, "I'll think about it." And then she left before either of them could say anything further. The second disruption arrived 20 minutes later in the hallway outside the dining room, where she was updating the evening's inventory, and the disruption's name was Lee Sora. Lee Sora was 28 years old and the daughter of one of Min-ho's oldest business alliances, and she arrived at the Kong estate 3 times a year with a beauty that announced itself in every room she entered and a particular attention to Min-ho that she did not bother to make subtle. She was not unpleasant to the staff. She was precisely pleasant, the kind that established hierarchy without hostility, and she wore it the way she wore everything, effortlessly. She stopped beside Stephenie in the hallway and looked at her with the curiosity of someone who had noticed something new. She said, "You're the one he drives home." Stephenie looked at her inventory. She said, "I'm not sure what you mean." Sora smiled. It was not unkind. It was the smile of a woman assessing a situation and drawing a conclusion she was confident about. She said, "Be careful," and moved on, heels precise on the marble floor. Stephenie stood with her inventory list and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite certainty but lived somewhere between them. And she thought about what Sora's 3 words meant and whether the warning was for her benefit or someone else's. That evening at dinner, which Stephenie served because it was her rotation, she was aware of Sora at the table in the way you were aware of weather systems when you were standing in the middle of one. Sora was seated 2 places from Min-ho and she was elegant and engaged, and she touched his arm twice with the ease of a woman who had been touching that arm for years and considered it a comfortable habit. Stephenie moved around the table with the practiced invisibility that was her skill, and she looked at nothing directly and she noticed everything. Min-ho did not touch Sora back. He was cordial. He was the particular Korean hospitality that was warm in temperature and careful in content. He spoke to everyone at the table with the same measured attention. Except once, when Stephenie reached across to refill a glass near his end and he said, quietly enough that only she heard it, "Are you all right?" She said, "Perfectly fine, Mr. Kong." He said, "Min-ho." She set the water jug down and moved away and did not look at Sora's face and did not think about what the expression on it might be. After dinner, she was in the kitchen when she heard raised voices from the south corridor. Not shouting. Controlled conversation at a volume that exceeded what the speaker intended to project. She recognized Sora's voice and she recognized the clipped single-syllable Korean responses that were Min-ho doing what he did when he wanted a conversation to end. She did not listen. She washed the serving dishes with focused attention and thought about nothing. But Hyun came in 10 minutes later and said, "Miss Stephenie, Mr. Kong asks if you are still in the house." She said, "Yes." Hyun said, "He asks if you would come to the library when you're finished." She dried her hands. She went to the library. He was standing at the window, which she had come to understand was where he stood when something was resolved and he was deciding where to go next. He turned when she came in. She said, "You wanted to see me." He said, "I wanted to make sure you were not uncomfortable with this evening." She said, "I'm staff." I don't get uncomfortable. He said, you're not just staff and we both know that. The library was dim and warm and entirely too small suddenly, and she stood just inside the doorway and he stood by the window and neither of them was pretending the way they usually pretended. She said, what are you doing? He said, I don't know yet. She said, that is not a reassuring answer. He said, I know. He looked at her steadily. I know exactly what this looks like from where you are standing and I know what you are probably thinking and I cannot tell you right now that those concerns are wrong. What I can tell you is that what I said this afternoon was true. I have stopped being interested in what is appropriate. She looked at him. She thought about her mother and good sense and invisible lines, and she also thought about coats that fit perfectly and a name said in a low voice and a man who drove her home on a night when he had no reason to. She said, Lee Sora. He said, is not a part of this conversation. She said, she was at dinner tonight. He said, she has dinner here 3 times a year as part of a business relationship that has never been and will never be anything else. He paused. I have never given her reason to believe otherwise. She said, she seems to believe otherwise. He said, what people believe and what I have told them are 2 different things. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I'm going home now. He said, Hyun will drive you. She said, I know, and left. And on the way out she passed Sora in the entry hall. And Sora looked at her with the expression of a woman who had lost a round she had not expected to lose, and Stephenie kept walking. A few days later, the danger arrived. Not metaphorical danger. Not the quiet, accumulating pressure of a man learning her name and a woman learning his. Real danger, the kind that came with black cars and silent phones and Hyun appearing at the door of the staff room at 6 in the morning with his face the way it was when things had moved beyond managing. He said, I need you to come with me. She said, what's happening? He said, there was an incident last night involving one of Mr. Kang's business rivals. They have information that this household was under surveillance. We are implementing full security protocol. She was moved to one of the estate's interior suites with 3 other senior staff members and she was told, with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, not to use her phone, not to stand near windows, and to wait. She waited. For 2 hours she sat on the edge of the guest suite bed and listened to the house, which had a different sound in security protocol. Quiet in the wrong way. Deliberate. Then the door opened and it was not Hyun. Min-ho came in with the look she had seen once before, the first night, in the smoke-dark corridor. Controlled on the surface and something enormous underneath it. He looked at her. He said, you're all right. She said, I'm fine. What happened? He said, a group affiliated with the Jong faction placed surveillance on this property. We have determined that they were specifically cataloging household staff. He stopped. He looked at her. You specifically. The cold that went through her was thorough. She said, why me? He said, because they know. He said it quietly. They have been watching this house for 3 weeks and they know that you are relevant to me. That you are not just staff. She looked at him. She felt the full weight of what she had been trying not to feel for weeks press against the place she had been keeping it. She said, how did they find that out? He said, because I have not been hiding it well. His voice was quiet and the control was doing more work than usual. I have been careless. And because of that, you are in danger. She said, what kind of danger? He sat down on the chair across from her, which was something she had not seen him do before, the deliberate choice to come down to her level, to make the space equal, and he said, the kind that I am going to remove immediately. But I needed you to understand why. Because you need to make a decision. She said, what decision? He said, whether you stay here where I can protect you, or whether you go somewhere else while this is resolved. He looked at her directly. I will not make that choice for you. I want to, but I won't. She looked at this man who ran half of Seoul and feared very little and was sitting across from her in a guest suite at 6 in the morning telling her he would not make a choice for her, and she felt something open in her chest that she had been keeping very carefully closed. She said, how long to resolve it? He said, a week, possibly less. She said, I'll stay. Something moved in his face. He said, you don't have to. She said, I know. I'm staying. He looked at her for a long moment, and the thing in his face that was usually behind glass was not behind glass, and she did not look away from it. He said, all right. He stood. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, I am sorry that my carelessness put you here, she said. Min-ho. He went completely still. She said, I don't blame you. He exhaled, slow and quiet. Then he left, and she sat in the guest suite and thought that she had just used his name for the first time and that it had felt like opening a door she would not be able to close again, and she found that she did not want to. The week that followed was the most dangerous and the most honest week of her life. She stayed in the main house under the security arrangement, and she continued her work because stopping would have been more frightening than working, and Min-ho moved through the house with the particular velocity of a man handling multiple things at once, and 3 times a day she felt him check on her without it looking like checking. A meal sent to her suite with the items she had mentioned once offhand that she preferred. A book left on the chair outside her door that she had borrowed from the library and returned. His security briefings included her by name, matter-of-factly, as though she had always been part of the circle of people whose safety was accounted for. On the 4th day, she found him in the kitchen at midnight. She had come for water. He was standing at the counter with a glass of something and the look of a man who had stopped sleeping because the things he was managing did not sleep either. He said, You should be in your suite. She said, I was thirsty. She got her water. She stood at the counter opposite him. After a moment he said, The Jong faction has agreed to a meeting. This will be over by Friday. She said, And after Friday? He looked at her. She looked back. The kitchen was quiet and the house was quiet, and they were 2 people standing in the truth of what had been accumulating between them for weeks. He said, After Friday, I would like to have a conversation that is not about your contract or your safety or anything logistical. She said, What kind of conversation? He said, The kind I have not had the right to have yet. She held her water glass. She said, Because I was just staff. He said, Because you were never just staff, and I knew that on the first night in the staircase, and I have been trying to be appropriate about it ever since, and I am out of appropriate. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything she had decided and every wall she had built, and her mother's voice saying, Do not build a home in a place that has not invited you to stay. She said, You are inviting me to stay. He said, I am asking you to stay. There is a difference. She held his gaze. She said, Ask me again on Friday. He nodded once. He picked up his glass. He said, Good night, Stephenie. She said, Good night, Min-ho. She walked back to her suite and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and felt the whole shape of what was happening and decided, with the particular clarity of someone who had stopped running from a true thing, that she was going to let it be what it was. Friday arrived with the quality of something that had been building for a very long time and had finally decided to arrive. Stephenie knew the meeting with the Jong faction was happening because the house went into a specific mode. Staff minimal, security doubled. Min-ho in the West study from early morning with Hyun and 2 other men whose names she did not know but whose presence she had learned to read as markers of serious business. She did her work. She moved through the house with the efficiency of 3 years' practice, and she did not think about Friday evening because thinking about it would make the hours longer, and the hours were already moving with the slowness of something important. By mid-afternoon word moved through the household the way things moved in a house like this, not announced, just felt. The meeting had concluded. The men from the Jong faction had left. Whatever had been agreed would hold, Hyun said, with the particular economy of a man who had overseen arrangements like this many times and had learned to carry them without leaking. Stephenie was in the south corridor folding the last of the afternoon linens when she heard his footsteps. She knew them. She had learned them over weeks without deciding to, the particular weight, the unhurried pace of a man who had decided where he was going and did not need to announce it with speed. He stopped in the corridor. She turned. He looked at her with the face that was not behind glass, the one she had been seeing in pieces for weeks and was now seeing completely. He said, It's Friday. She said, I know. He said, Do you have somewhere to be? She said, I'm off duty at 6. He said, Come to the garden at 6. She said, All right. He left. She stood with the folded linens and felt her heart doing the thing it had been doing since a smoke-dark corridor and a pair of eyes that went still, and this time she let it. The garden at 6 was cool and blue with the last of the October light, and it smelled like the stone planters and the late chrysanthemums and the city somewhere beyond the walls doing what the city always did without caring about anything that happened inside these gates. Min-ho was already there when she arrived. He was not in his suit jacket. He was in the dark clothes he wore when he was done performing the architecture of himself for the day, and he was standing near the old stone bench at the center of the garden, and he looked at her when she came through the door, and something in him settled. She could see it, like a thing that had been slightly off balance and had found its center. She walked toward him and stopped a few feet away and said, "You wanted to talk?" He said, "I wanted to say several things, and I have been organizing them for 3 days." She almost smiled. She said, "That sounds like you." He said, "It does." He looked at her steadily. "Stephenie, I am not going to tell you that this is simple. You work in my house. I am aware of what that looks like from outside. I am aware of the power it gives me and the disadvantage it creates for you, and I am aware that a man in my position who develops feelings for a woman in your position should be very careful about how he moves." She said, "And are you being careful?" He said, "I have been careful. I drove you home myself on a night when I had no excuse to. I had a coat made because I noticed you were cold. I had a man removed from the property because he was speaking to you in a way that I found unacceptable." He paused. "That is the behavior of a man who stopped being careful some time ago and was telling himself a story about it." She looked at him. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because you deserve complete information before you make any decision." He took one step toward her. "I am not a simple man. My world is not a safe one. I have enemies, and I have responsibilities, and I have a life that does not resemble anything ordinary. And I have been standing inside that life for 12 years without wanting to bring anyone into it." She said, "Until now." He said, "Until you." The garden was very quiet. The chrysanthemums moved slightly in the evening wind, and the city hummed beyond the walls, and she stood in front of this man who ran half of Seoul and had made a coat for her and said her name like it belonged in his mouth, and she felt the full truth of what she had been standing just outside of for weeks. She said, "Minho, I am not afraid of your world. I have been managing things more complicated than safety protocols since I was 19 years old. I know exactly what you are, and I have been watching you be it for 3 years, and I am not frightened." He said, "You should be a little." She said, "I know." She took the step he had not taken. She was close now, close enough to see every line of his face, and his face was doing all the things it did when the glass was gone. She said, "Ask me." He said, "Stay. Not as staff. Not as an arrangement. As mine. And as someone whose world becomes mine to care for." He looked at her with everything present. "I am asking." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about every wall she had built and every reason she had assembled and the full careful structure of her resistance. And she thought about her mother saying, "Do not build a home in a place that has not invited you to stay." She was being invited. She said, "Yes." He breathed in. Just once, but it was the kind of breath that carried the weight of something long held being set down. And then his hand came up and touched her face, the way you touched something you had been careful with and were still being careful with, warm and certain and not going anywhere. She leaned into it. He said her name once, quiet and full of everything. She said, "I know." He kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that was not an announcement or a beginning but a recognition. The acknowledgement of something that had been true for longer than either of them had said it, warm and unhurried and complete. And she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat and thought that the city could go on doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent, and she was staying exactly where she was. Later, they sat on the stone bench in the garden that had gone dark and blue, and she told him about Enugu and her mother and the 19-year-old girl who had decided that being capable was the most reliable form of safety, and he listened the way he listened to everything she said, with his full attention, not performing it, just giving it. He told her about his father, who had built this empire on foundations that cost people, and the 12 years he had spent deciding what to do with that inheritance. He told her it without the controlled surface, without the armor, and she understood that this was something he did not give away lightly, and she held it accordingly. By the end of the evening, the house was quiet around them, and she was aware that something had changed in the fundamental arrangement of her life, and she felt no panic about that at all. The months that followed were not without difficulty. There were people in Minho's circle who looked at her and looked at him and drew conclusions that landed in various forms, some as rumors, some as pointed social silences, some as comments made in rooms she was not in but that reached her anyway. She had spent 3 years learning to be invisible in this house, and she found now that visibility had its own set of skills to develop. Lee Sora came for dinner in November and looked at the place that had shifted between Minho and Stephenie with an expression that contained a great deal and released very little. She was gracious about it, in the end, which Stephenie respected. It cost something to be gracious about things like that, and she did not minimize what it cost. The escalation that winter arrived from an unexpected direction. Minho's younger brother, Kang Minjun, who had been living in Japan for 2 years managing the family's legitimate shipping interests, returned to Seoul in December and came to the estate with opinions he had no hesitation about sharing. He found Stephenie in the library, which had long since become both of theirs in the way that spaces became theirs once you stopped performing them. He said, in English that was precise and slightly cold, "You understand what my family is?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And you understand that people who enter this world do not get to leave it simply." She said, "I understand that better than you might expect." He said, "My brother has never kept anyone." He looked at her with the assessment of a man who was performing due diligence. "Why you?" She looked back at him with the steadiness of a woman who had built 3 years of capability in this house and was not going to be evaluated out of what she had decided. She said, "That is a question for him. But if you are asking whether I am here for what your family has, the answer is no. I was here before I knew what he felt, and I stayed because of who he is, not what." Minjun looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right," and left, and she understood that she had passed something, though no one would announce it. Minho found her in the library afterward and said, "My brother came to see you." She said, "He did." He said, "What did he say?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be. He loves you." That's what that was. Minho looked at her with the open face and said, "He told me afterward that you were exactly what I needed, and he was sorry for being late to understand it." She said, "I like him." He said, "He likes you." Coming from Minjun, that is roughly equivalent to a medal. She laughed and he came across the library and kissed her temple, and she thought that December in Seoul was quite possibly the warmest she had ever felt. The real crisis arrived in February. It came because 12 years of dismantling an empire built on darkness meant that darkness pushed back. And what came in February was the kind of threat that moved beyond surveillance and faction meetings into something that broke through the front gate on a Wednesday morning when Minho was in the city. Stephenie was in the East Wing. She heard the alarm and she moved toward the service corridor and found it blocked the way it had been blocked on the first night. Except this time the reason was not a faulty lock, but 2 men she did not know who had come through the gate and into the house before security closed the breach. She was smart. 3 years in this house had given her a map of every room and every exit and every place where a person could be and not be found, and she used that map now with the cold clarity of someone who was afraid but was not going to be controlled by the fear. She moved to the panic room, which she had been shown the location of on her second week and had never used, and she got inside and she activated the communicator, and she said, "This is Stephenie, I am in the safe room, there are 2 individuals in the East Wing." Hyun's voice came back immediately. "Stay where you are. Do not open the door for anyone." She said, "I know." She sat in the panic room and breathed slowly and methodically and thought about everything she still wanted to do and every conversation she had not finished, and she was aware, with great precision, that she was not ready to leave any of it. Minho's car was back through the gate in 11 minutes. She would learn this later. She would learn that he had been in a meeting 40 minutes from the estate, and that when Hyun's message reached him, he had said nothing to the people in the room and walked out, and he had been in the car before Hyun finished the second sentence. The 2 intruders were from the Jong faction. The agreement made in October had not held because agreements made under pressure rarely held perfectly, and this was the faction testing the seams. They were dealt with by Minho's security with the efficiency of men who had been waiting for exactly this and had prepared for it accordingly. When the all-clear came, the panic room door opened and Minho was standing outside it. His face was the one from the staircase, from the night in October, the enormous thing underneath the surface, not behind glass at all. He looked at her. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No. I used the safe room." He said, "I know." He looked at her steadily. "You did exactly right." She said, "I know." She paused. "You came back very fast." He said, "Yes." She said, "You were 40 minutes away." He said, "I was." She looked at him. She said, "How fast were you driving?" Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else but was warm and unguarded and wholly him. He said, "Fast enough." She put her hand against his chest. He put his over it. They stood in the corridor outside the panic room with the all-clear still echoing through the house, and she felt his heartbeat and thought about 11 minutes and a man who had walked out of a meeting without a word and driven at speeds that probably alarmed his driver. And she thought this was what it meant to be relevant to someone. She said, "Min-ho." He said, "Yes." She said, "I love you." She said it the way she said everything important, straightforwardly and without decoration, because she had learned that the most honest things were also the most direct. I have been standing next to that for several months, and I am not going to stand next to it anymore without saying it. He looked at her for a long moment, and the enormous thing that was always underneath came fully to the surface, and he said, "I love you. I have loved you since a smoke-dark staircase in October, and I have been organizing it into the right shape to say ever since, and you have said it first, which is entirely consistent with who you are." She said, "Are you going to say it back properly or keep describing it?" He said, "I love you, Stephenie Adaora," and he said her full name the way he said her name, like it was specific only to him, and he kissed her with the full weight of 12 months of coats and staircases and midnight kitchens and panic rooms and everything in between, and the house held them in its quiet warmth, and outside Seoul moved the way it always moved, large and lit and entirely indifferent. The engagement was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention, which was everyone. He asked her in the garden in April when the spring had come back to the chrysanthemums and the light was the particular gold that she had decided was specifically Seoul's. Sitting on the stone bench with his knee against hers and a box he had been carrying in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks because he had been waiting for a moment that felt like the truth. She said yes before he finished the question. He said, "I was still talking." She said, "I know. The answer is yes." He laughed, and she felt it against her hair, and she thought about a woman in Enugu who had raised her to know her own value, and she thought her mother was going to cry about this and then recover her composure immediately, which she also thought was exactly right. They were married in June. Small ceremony, estate garden. The chrysanthemums replaced by summer flowers Stephenie had chosen herself, which had caused a quiet and highly productive argument with the florist that Min-ho had watched from across the room with the expression of a man who found her completely wonderful and intended to keep telling her so. Min-jun stood beside his brother and cried exactly twice and denied it both times. Adiz flew in from Lagos and wore a dress that stopped 3 conversations in the entry hall and said to Min-ho, before the ceremony, that she had known Stephenie her whole life and if he was not careful he was going to be the luckiest man alive. Min-ho said, "I am already the luckiest man alive." Adiz looked at him. She said, "Good." Then she went to find the best seat. The ceremony was in the afternoon, the garden gold with the June light, and Min-ho looked at her coming through the door with the face that had no glass in it, no armor, no surface, just him and everything he felt, and she walked toward him thinking about a smoke-dark staircase and a coat and a name said quietly and 3 years of invisible work becoming a life she had not known to want and wanted with her whole self. She stood beside him and he took her hand and held it with the certainty she had come to know as his most specific characteristic, warm and decided and not letting go. The words were said. The rings were exchanged. When it was done he looked at her in the June garden in front of everyone who mattered and said, very quietly, just for her, "This is the truest thing I have ever done." She said, "I know." He kissed her and the garden applauded and somewhere nearby Adiz made a sound of deep personal satisfaction and Min-jun was very focused on the view of the city in the distance. 8 months later, in the February of the following year, Stephenie sat in the estate's east wing, which had long since been repaired and repainted and turned into a room she had chosen the curtains for, and she held a small piece of paper with a result on it, and she thought about smoke-dark staircases and coats that fit perfectly and names said like they belonged in a specific mouth, and a man who drove 40 minutes in 11 minutes because that was what mattered to him. She went to find him. He was in the library. She stood in the doorway and he looked up and he said, immediately, "What is it?" She said, "The good kind of something." She showed him the paper. He looked at it. He looked at her. The thing that came into his face then was the largest version she had ever seen of the thing that was always underneath everything. The thing without a name except that it was entirely real and entirely his, and it had been hers since October. He came across the library in 3 steps and he put his arms around her and she felt his heartbeat, rapid and genuine and absolutely certain. He said, against her hair, "I told you we were going to be considerably more than all right." She held on to him and thought about all the things she had been afraid of and all the things she had chosen anyway, and the specific extraordinary ordinary life that had grown from a moment in a smoke-dark staircase when a man had looked at her and something in him had gone still. She said, "You were right." He said, I usually am. She laughed. The library held them in its warm light, and outside Seoul was doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and inside, a man who had run half the city and feared very little pressed his face into the hair of the woman who had walked into his house invisible and walked into his life impossible and made him understand, finally, the difference between managing a world and being in one. And in the garden, the spring was already beginning.